Book 3, Bekla. Elleroth, Chapter 24 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Bekla, city of myth and conjecture, hidden in time as Tiahuanaco in the Andes fastness, as Petra in the hills of Edom, as Atlantis beneath the waves. Bekla of enigma and secrets, more deeply enfolded in its religious mystery than Eleusis of the reaped corn, than the stone giants of the Pacific, or the curate lands of Prester John. Its grey, broken walls, across whose parapets only the clouds came marching, in whose hollows the wind sounds and ceases like the trumpeter of Krakow or Memnon's statue on the sands, the stars reflected in its waters, the flowers scenting its gardens, are become like words heard in a dream that cannot be recalled. Its very history lies buried, unresolved. Coins, beads, and gaming boards, street below street, shards below shards, hearth beneath hearth, ash under ash. The earth has been dug away from Troy and Mycenae, the jungle cut from about Zimbabwe, and caged in maps and clocks are the terrible leagues about Urumqi and Ulaanbaatar. But who shall disperse the moon-dim darkness that covers Bekla, or draw it up to view from depths more lonely and remote than those where Basojijas and Uthusa swim in black silence? Only sometimes through tales may it be guessed at, those tokens riddling as the carved woods from the Americas floating centuries ago to the shores of Portugal and Spain, or in dreams perhaps it may be glimpsed from the decks of that unchanging navy of gods and images that sails by night, carrying its passengers still in no bottoms else than those which bore, in their little time, Pilate's wife, Joseph of Canaan, and the wise Penelope of Ithaca with her 20 geese. Bekla the incomparable, the lily of the plain, the garden of sculpted and dancing stone, appears from its mist and dusk, faint as the tracks of Shardik himself in forests long consumed. 6 miles round were the walls, rising on the south to encircle the summit of Mount Crandor, with its citadel crowning the sheer face of the stone quarries below. A breakneck flight of steps led up that face, disappearing at a height of 80 feet into the mouth of a tunnel, which ran upwards through the rock to emerge into the twilight of the huge granary cellar. The only other entry to the citadel was the so-called Red Gate in the south wall, a low arch through which a chalybeate brook flowed from its source within to the chain of falls, named the White Girls, that carried it down Crandor's gradual southern slope. Under the Red Gate, men long ago had worked to widen and deepen the bed of the brook, but had left standing, 2 feet below the surface of the water, a narrow, twisting causeway of the living rock. Those who had learned this path's subaqueous windings could wade safely through the deep pool, and then, if permitted, enter the citadel by the stairway known as the vent. It was not Mount Crandor, however, which drew the gaze of the newcomer to Bekla, but the ridge of the Leopard Hill below, with its terraces of vines, flowers, and citrus tendriona. On the crest, above these surrounding gardens, stood the palace of the barons, the range of its towers reflecting light from their balconies of polished rose-colored marble. 20 round towers there were in all, 8 by the long sides of the palace, and 4 by the short, each tapering circular wall so smooth and regular that in sunlight not one stone's lower edge cast a shadow upon its fellow below, and the only blackness was that within the window openings, rounded and slitted like keyholes, which lit up the spiral stairways. High up, as high as tall trees, the circular balconies projected like the capitals of columns, their ambulatories wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. The marble balustrades were identical in height and shape, yet each was decorated differently, carved on each side in low relief with leopards, lilies, birds, or fish, so that a lord might say to his friend, "I will drink with you tonight on the Bramba Tower," or a lover to his mistress, "Let us meet this evening on the Trepsis Tower and watch the sunset before we go to supper." Above these marvelous crow's nests the towers culminated in slender painted spires, red, blue, and green, latticed and containing gong-toned copper bells. When these were rung, 4 bells to each note of the scale, the metallic, wavering sounds mingled with their own echoes from the precipices of Crandor, and vibrated over the roofs below, until the citizens, thus summoned to rejoice at festival, holiday, or royal welcome, laughed to feel their ears confounded in sport, as the eye is confounded by mirrors face to face. The palace itself stood within its towers, and separate by several yards from their bases. Yet, wonderful to see, at the height of the roof, that part of the wall that stood behind each tower sloped outwards, supported on massive corbels, to embrace it and project a little beyond, so that the towers themselves, with their pointed spires, looked like great lances, set upright at regular intervals to pierce the walls and support the roof, as a canopy is supported at the periphery. The vaulted parapets were carved in relief with the round leaves of flame-shaped flower-buds of lilies and lotus, and to these the craftsmen had added, here and there as it pleased them, the likenesses of insects, of trailing weeds, and drops of water, all many times larger than life. The hard light of noon stressed little of these fancies, accentuating rather the single shadowed mass of the north front, grave and severe as a judge presiding above the busy streets. But at evening, when the heat of the day broke and the hard shadows fled away, the red slanting light would soften the outline of walls and towers, and emphasize instead their marvelous decoration, so that at this hour the palace suggested rather some beautiful, pleasure-loving woman, adorned with jewels and flowers, ready for a joyous meeting or a homecoming beyond compare. And by the first light of day, before the gongs of the city's 2 water clocks clashed one after the other for sunrise, it had changed yet again and become, in the misty stillness, like a pool of water-lilies, half opened among the dragonflies and sipping, splashing swallows. Some way from the foot of the Leopard Hill was the newly excavated rock-pit, immediately above which stood the house of the king, a gaunt square of rooms and corridors surrounding a hall, once a barracks for soldiers, but now reserved for another use and another occupant. Close by, grouped about the north side of the cypress gardens and the lake called the Barb, were stone buildings, resembling those on Kiso, but larger and more numerous. Some of these were used as dwellings by the Ortelgan leaders, while others were set aside for hostages or for delegations from the various provincial peoples, whose comings and goings, with embassies to the king or petitions to lay before the generals, were incessant in this empire at war on a debatable frontier. Beyond the cypress gardens, a walled road led to the Peacock Gate, the only way through the fortified rampart dividing the upper from the lower city. The lower city, the city itself, its paved streets and dusty alleys, its odors and clamor by day, its moonlight and jasmine by night, its cripples and beggars, its animals, its merchandise, its traces everywhere of war and pillage, doors hacked and walls blackened with fire. Does the city, too, return out of the dark? Here ran the street of the money-changers, and beyond, on either side of a narrow avenue of ilex trees, stood the houses of the jewel merchants, high, barred windows, and a couple of strong fellows at the gate to inquire a stranger's business. The torpid flies about the open sweet stalls, the smells of leather and dung and spices and sweat and herbs, the fruit market's bank of gaudy panniers, the rostra, barracoons, and blocks of the slave market with its handsome children, its cozening foreigners and outlandish tongues, the shoemakers, sitting absorbed at their tapping and stitching in the midst of the hubbub, the clinking street-walkers, strolling nowhere in particular with their stylized gait and sidelong glances, the colored flowers in the water, the shouting across the street of the news of a sale or an offer in cryptic words revealing nothing except to their intended hearer, the quarrels, the lies, the promises, the thieves, the long-drawn crying of wares on notes that the years have turned into songs, the streets of the stonemasons, carpenters, weavers, of the astrologers, doctors, and fortune-tellers, the scuttling lizards, the rats and dogs, the fowls in coops and the pretty birds in cages. The cattle market had been burned to the ground in the fighting, and on one of the sagging open doors of the temple of Cran someone had daubed the mask of a bear, 2 eyes and a snarling muzzle set between round ears. The Tamarick Gate, that wonder second only to the palace, was gone forever. Gone the concentric filigree spheres, the sundial with its phallic gnomon and nympholeptic spiral of hours, the incredible faces peering through the green leaves of the sycamore, the great ferns and the blue-tongued lichens, the wind harp and the silver drum that beat of itself when the sacred doves alighted at evening to be fed. The fragments of Fleetiel's masterpiece, constructed in an age when none conceived it possible that war could approach Bekla, had been gleaned from the rubble secretly and with bitter tears, during the night before Gedladan and his men supervised the building by forced labor of a new wall to close the gap. The 2 remaining gates, the Blue Gate and the Gate of Lilies, were very strong and entirely suited to Bekla's present and more dangerous role of a city that scarcely knew friend from foe. On this cloudy spring morning, the surface of the Barb, ruffled by the south wind, had the dull, broken shine of an incised glaze. Along the lonelier southeastern shore, from which pasture land, enclosed within the city walls, stretched away up the slopes of Crandor, a flock of cranes were feeding and squabbling, wading through the shallows and bending their long necks down to the weed. On the opposite side, in the sheltering cypress gardens, men were strolling about in 2s and 3s, or sitting out of the wind in the evergreen arbors. Some were attended by servants, who walked behind them carrying cloaks, papers, and writing materials, while others, harsh-voiced and shaggy as brigands, broke from time to time into loud laughter or slapped each other's shoulders, betraying, even while they tried to hide it, the lack of ease which they felt in these trim and unaccustomed surroundings. Others, again, clearly wished to be known for soldiers, and, though personally unarmed, in deference to the place and the occasion, had instructed their servants to carry their empty scabbards conspicuously. It seemed that a number of these men were strangers to each other, for their greetings, as they passed, were formal, a bow, a grave nod, or a few words, yet their very presence together showed that they must have something in common. After a time, a certain restlessness, even impatience, began to show among them. Evidently they were waiting for something that was delayed. At length, the figure of a woman, scarlet-cloaked and carrying a silver staff, was seen approaching the garden from the king's house. There was a general move in the direction of the gate leading into the walled road, so that by the time the woman reached it, 40 or 50 men were already waiting there. As she entered, some thronged about her, others, with an air of detachment, idled or pretended to idle within earshot. The woman, dour and stolid in manner, looked round among them, raised in greeting her hand with its crimson wooden rings, and began to speak. Although she spoke in Beklan, it was plain that this was not her tongue. Her voice had the slow, flat cadence of Teltherna province, and she was, as they all knew, a priestess of the conquerors, an Ortilgan. My lords, the king greets you and welcomes you to Bekla. He is grateful to each of you, for he knows that you have the strength and safety of the empire at heart. As you all know, it was... At this moment she was interrupted by the stammering excitement of a thick-set, lank-haired man, who spoke with the accent of a westerner from Paltesh. Madame Sheldra, say it. Tell us, the king, Lord Krendrick, no harm has befallen him? Sheldra turned towards him unsmilingly and stared him into silence. Then she continued. As you all know, he intended to have received you this morning in audience at the palace, and to have held the first meeting of the council this afternoon. He has now been obliged to alter this intention. She paused, but there was no further interruption. All were listening with attention. The distant idlers came closer, glancing at each other with raised eyebrows. General Gedladan was expected to reach Bekla last night, together with the delegates from eastern Lipan. However, they have been unexpectedly delayed. A messenger reached the king at dawn with the news that they will not be here until this evening. The king therefore asks your patience for a day. The audience will be held at this time tomorrow, and the council will commence in the afternoon. Until then, you are the guests of the city, and the king will welcome all who may wish to sup with him in the palace an hour after sunset. A tall, beardless man, wearing a fox fur cloak over a white pleated kilt and a purple damask tunic blazoned with 3 corn sheaves, came strolling elegantly along the terrace and turned his eyes towards the crowd as though he had just noticed them for the first time. He stopped, paused a moment, and then addressed Sheldra across their heads in the courteous and almost apologetic tone of a gentleman questioning someone else's servant. "I wonder what might have delayed the general. Perhaps you can be so kind as to tell me?" Sheldra made no immediate reply, and it seemed that her self-possession was not altogether equal either to the question or to the questioner. She appeared to be not so much considering the question as hoping that it might go away, as though it were some kind of pestering insect. She betrayed no actual confusion, but at length, keeping her eyes on the ground, she turned, avoiding the tall man's gaze in the manner of some governess or duenna in a wealthy house, out of countenance to find herself required to respond graciously to unsought attention from friends of the family. She was about to leave when the newcomer, inclining his sleek head and persisting in his kindly and condescending manner, stepped smoothly through the crowd to her side. "You see, I am most anxious to learn, since, if I am not mistaken, the general's army is at present in Lipan province, and any misfortune of his would certainly be mine as well. I am sure that in the circumstances you will excuse my importunity." Sheldra's muttered answer seemed appropriate less to a royal messenger than to some gauche and sullen waiting-woman in a yeoman's kitchen. "He stayed with the army, I think. I heard, that is. He is coming soon." "Thank you," replied the tall man. "He had some reason, no doubt. I know that you will wish to help me if you can." Sheldra flung up her head like a mare troubled by the flies. "The enemy in Ikat, General Iketless, General Gedladan, wished to leave everything secure before he set out for Bekla. And now, my lords, I must leave you until tomorrow." Almost forcing her way past them, she left the garden with the clumsy and less than becoming haste. The man with the corn sheaves tunic strolled on towards the shrubbery by the lake, looking across at the feeding cranes, and toying with a silver pomander secured to his belt by a fine gold chain. He shivered in the wind, and drew his cloak closer about him, lifting the hem above the damp grass with a kind of stylized grace almost like that of a girl on the dancing floor. He had stopped to admire the mauve-stippled, frosty sparkle on the petals of an early flowering saldus, when someone plucked his sleeve from behind. He looked over his shoulder. The man who had attracted his attention stood looking back at him with a grin. He had a rugged, somewhat battered appearance, and the sceptical air of a man who has experienced much, gained advancement and posterity in a hard school, and come to regard both with certain detachment. "Mallow!" cried the tall man, opening his arms in a gesture of welcome. "My dear fellow, what a pleasant surprise! I thought you were in Terkenalt across the Vraco, in the clouds, anywhere but here. If I weren't half frozen in this pestilential city, I'd be able to show all the pleasure I feel instead of only half of it." Thereupon he embraced Mallow, who appeared a trifle embarrassed, but took it in good part, and then, holding him by the hand at arm's length, as though they were dancing some courtly measure, looked him up and down, shaking his head slowly, and continuing to speak as he had commenced, in Yeldeshe, the tongue of Ikat and the south. Wasting away, obviously full of tribesmen snapped-off arrowheads and rot-gut booze from the barracks of beyond. One wonders why the holes made by the former wouldn't drain off some of the latter. But come, tell me how you happen to be here, and how's Cabin and all the jolly water boys?" "I'm the governor of Cabin now," replied Mallow with a grin, "so the place has come down in the world." "My dear fellow, I congratulate you. So the water rats have engaged the services of a wolf. Very prudent, very prudent." He half sang a couple of lines. "A jolly old cattle thief said to his wife, 'San tan ten free, I mean to leave easy the rest of my life.'" "That's it," said Mallow with a grin. "After that little business of the slave wars we got mixed up in." "When you saved my life." When I saved your life. God help me, I must have been out of my mind. I couldn't stay in Cabin. What was there for me? My father sand-blind in the chimney corner, and my eldest brother taking good care that neither Shrane nor I got anything out of the estate. Shrane raised 40 men and joined the Becklin army, but I didn't fancy that, and I decided to go further. Arrowheads and rotgut. Well, you're right, that's about it. Boot, brute, and loot, as it were. If you can't steal it, you've got to fight for it, that's it. I made myself useful. I finished up as a provincial governor to the King of Dealgai. Honest work for a change. In Dealgai, Mullo? Oh, come now. Well, fairly honest, anyway. Plenty of headaches and worries. Too much responsibility. I can vividly imagine your feelings on discovering yourself north of the Teltherna in sole command of Fort Horrible. It was Clamsend province, actually. Well, it's one way of feathering your nest if you can survive. That was where I was when I heard of Shrane's death. He was killed by the Ortelgans 5 years ago now at the Battle of the Foothills, when Galethlin lost his army. Poor lad. Anyway, about 6 months back, a Dealgai merchant comes up before me for a travel permit, a nasty, slimy brute by the name of Lalok. When we're alone, "Are you Lord Mullo," he says, "from Cabin of the Waters?" "I'm Mullo the Governor," says I, "and apt to come down heavy on oily flatterers." "Why, my lord," he says, "there's no flattery." Flottery, you mean? Well, flottery, then. I can't imitate their talk. "I've come from spending the rainy season at Cabin," he says. "And there's news for you. Your elder brother's dead, and the property's yours, but no one knew where to find you. You've 3 months in law to claim it." What's that to me, I thought to myself, but later I got to thinking about it, and I knew I wanted to go home. So I appointed my duty as governor on my own authority, and sent the king a message to say what I'd done, and left. The inhabitants were heartbroken. The pigs wept real tears in the bedrooms. They may have. I didn't notice. You can't tell them from the inhabitants anyway. It was a bad journey at that time of year. I nearly drowned crossing the Teltherna by night. It had to be by night? Well, I was in a hurry, you see. Not to be observed? Not to be observed. I went over the hills by way of Gelt. I wanted to see where Shrane died, say a few prayers for him, and make an offering, you know. My God, that's an awful place. I don't want to talk about it. The ghosts must be thicker than frogs in a marsh. I wouldn't be there at night for all the gold and Bekla. Shrane's at peace anyway. I did all that's proper. Well, when I came down the pass to the plain, and I had to pay toll at the southern end, that was new. It was late afternoon already, and I thought, I shan't get to Cabin tonight. I'll go to old Smar Turin, him that used to breed the prize bulls when my father was alive, that's it. When I got there, only myself and a couple of fellows, why, you never saw a place so much changed. Servants by the bushel, everything made of silver, all the women in silk and jewels. Smar was just the same, though, and he remembered me all right. When we were drinking together after dinner, I said, "Bulls seem to be paying well." "Oh," says he, "haven't you heard? They've made me governor of the foothills and warden of the Gelt Pass." "How on earth did that come about?" I asked. "Well," says he, "you've got to watch out to jump the right way in time of trouble. It's a case of win all or lose all. After I'd heard what happened at the Battle of the Foothills, I knew these Ortelgans were bound to take Bekla. It stood to reason. They were meant to win. I could see it plain, but no one else seemed able to. I went straight to their generals myself, caught 'em up as they were marching south across the plain to Bekla, and promised them all the help I could give. You see, the night before the battle, the best half of Galethlin's army had been sent to Cabin to repair the dam, and if that wasn't the finger of God, what was? The rains had just begun, but all the same, those Becklins at Cabin were in the Ortelgans' rear as they marched south. It's not the sort of risk any general can feel happy about. I made it impossible for them to move, took my fellows out and destroyed 3 bridges, sent false information to Cabin, intercepted their messengers. Lord, says I to Smar, what a gamble to take on the Ortelgans. Not at all, says Smar. I can tell you when lightning's going to strike, and I don't need to know exactly where. I tell you, the Ortelgans were meant to win. That half-army of poor old Galethlin simply broke up, never fought again. They marched out of Cabin in the rain, turned back again, went on half rations. Then there was mutiny, wholesale desertion. By the time a messenger got through from Santilocay or Kitlis, a mutineers' faction was in command, and they nearly hanged the poor fellow. A lot of that was my doing, and didn't I let this King Krendrick fellow know it too? That was how the Ortelgans came to make me governor of the foothills and warden of the Gelt Pass, my boy, and very lucrative it is. All of a sudden, Smar looks up at me. "Have you come home to claim the family property?" he asks. "That's it," I said. "Well," says he, "I never liked your brother, griping, hard-fisted curmudgeon, but you're all right. They're short of a governor in Cabin. There was a foreigner there until recently, name of Orcat, formerly in the Becklin service. He understood the reservoir, you see, and that's more than the Ortelgans do, but he's just been murdered. Now, you're a local lad, so you won't get murdered, and the Ortelgans like local men as long as they feel they can trust them. After what's happened, they trust me, naturally, and if I put in a word with General Zelda, you'll probably be appointed. Well, the long and short of it was, I agreed to make it worth Smar's while to speak for me, and that's how I came to be Governor of Kabin. I see. And you commune with the reservoir from the profound depths of your aquatic knowledge, do you? I've no idea how to look after a reservoir, but while I'm here I mean to find someone who has, and take him back with me, that's it. And is he up here now for the council, your charming old bull-breeding chum? Smar? Not he. He sent his deputy. He's no fool. How long have you been governor of Kabin? About 3 days. I tell you, all this happened very recently. General Zelda was recruiting in those parts, as it happened, and Smar saw him the next day. I'd not been back home more than one night when he sent an officer to tell me I was appointed governor and order me to come to Bekla in person. So here I am, Elleroth, you see, and the first person I run into is you. Elleroth bowed 3 times before addressing me. Well, we have become an exalted pair, that's it. Ban of Sarkid? How long have you been Elleroth Ban? Oh, a few years now. My poor father died a while back. But tell me, how much do you know about the new modern Bekla and its humane and enlightened rulers? At this moment, 2 of the other delegates overtook them, talking earnestly in Catrian Chistel, the dialect of Eastern Terkenalt. One, as he passed, turned his head, and continued to stare unsmilingly over his shoulder for some moments before resuming his conversation. You ought to be more careful, said Mallow. Remarks like that shouldn't be made at all in a place like this, let alone overheard. My dear fellow, how much Yeldashay do you suppose those cultivated pumpkins understand? Their bodies scarcely cover their minds with propriety. Their oafishness is indecently exposed. You never know. Discretion. That's one thing I've learnt, and I'm alive to prove it. Very well. We will indulge your desire for privacy, chilly though it may be to do so. Yonder is a fellow with a boat, yo-ho, and no doubt he has his price like everyone in this world. Addressing the boatman, as he had Sheldra, in excellent Beklan, with scarcely a trace of Yeldashay accent, Elleroth gave him a 10-melled piece, fastened his fox-fur cloak at the throat, turned up the deep collar round the back of his head, and stepped into the boat, followed by Mallow. As the man rowed them out towards the centre of the lake, and the choppy wavelets began to set up a regular hollow slapping under the bow, Elleroth remained silent, staring intently across at the grazing land that extended from the southern side of the king's house, round the western shore of the lake, and on to the northern slopes of Crandor in the distance. Lonely, isn't it? He said at last, still speaking in Yeldashay. Lonely? Replied Mallow. Hardly that. Well, let us say relatively unfrequented, and that ground's nice and smooth, no obstacles. Good. He paused, smiling at Mallow's frowning incomprehension. But, to resume where we were so poignantly interrupted, how much do you know about Bekla and these bear-bemused river boys from the Teltherna? I tell you, next to nothing. I've had hardly any time to find out. Did you know, for example, that after the battle in the foothills 5.5 years ago, they didn't bury the dead, neither their own nor Galathlin's? They left them for the wolves and the kites. I'm not surprised to hear it. I've been on that field, as I told you, and I've never been so glad to leave anywhere. My 2 fellows were almost crazy with fear, and that was in daylight. I did what I had to be done for Shrain's sake, and came away quick. Did you see anything? No, it was just what we all felt. Oh, you mean the remains of the dead? No, we didn't stray off the road, you see, and that was cleared soon after the battle by men who came down from Gelt to do it, so I heard. Yes, the Orthelgans, of course, didn't bother. But it wasn't really to be expected that they would, was it? By the time the battle was won, the rains had set in, the night was falling. Wasn't that it? They were desperate to get on to Bekla. Yes, but no Ortelgan did anything after Bekla had fallen either, although there must have been plenty of coming and going between Bekla and their Teltherna island. I find that terribly tedious as a subject for contemplation, don't you? It bores me to distraction. I hadn't considered it before in quite that way. Start now. The boat, turning, had followed first the southern and then the eastern shore of the Barb, and as it approached them, the cranes flew up in a clattering white-winged flock. Elleroth bent his head over the bow, idly running one finger through the water along the outline of his own shadow as it moved across the surface. After some time, Mollo said, "I've never understood why the gay city fell. They took it by surprise and smashed in the Tamarack Gate. Well, all right, so the Tamarack Gate was military nonsense, but what was Santal Carricketlas doing? Why didn't he try to hold the citadel? You could hold that place forever." He pointed back at the sheer face of the quarry, 3/4 of a mile away, and the summit of Crandor above. "He did hold it," answered Elleroth, "right through the rains and after, getting on for 4 months altogether. He was hoping for some relief from Ikat, or even from the troops at Cabin, the ones your trusty bull-breeding friend attended to. The Ortelgans let him alone for a long time. They'd come to have a healthy respect for him, I dare say, but when the rains were over and he was still there, they began to worry. They needed to put an army in the field towards Ikat, you see, and there was no one to spare to keep Santal contained in the citadel. So they got rid of him." "Got rid of him? Just like that? What do you mean? How?" Elleroth struck the surface lightly with the edge of his hand, so that a thin, pattering crescent of water drops flew backward along the side of the boat. "Really, Mollo, you don't seem to have learnt much about military methods during your travels. There were plenty of children in Bekla, even if all of them weren't children of the citadel garrison. They hanged 2 children every morning in sight of the citadel. And of course there were plenty of mothers, too, at liberty to go up to the citadel and beg Ketlas to come to terms before the Ortelgans became even more inventive. After some days he offered to go, provided he was allowed to march out fully armed and proceed unmolested to Ikat. Those terms the Ortelgans accepted. 3 days later they tried to attack him on the march, but he'd been expecting something of the sort, and succeeded in discouraging them quite effectively. That happened near my home in Sarkid, as a matter of fact." Mollo was about to reply when Elleroth, seated at the boatman's back, spoke again without any alteration in his quiet tone. "We are about to run into a large floating log, which will probably stave in the bow." The boatman stopped rowing at once and turned his head. "Where, sir?" he asked in Becklin. "I don't see anything." "Well, I see that you understand me when I am speaking Yeldeshe," replied Elleroth, "but that is not a crime. It seems to have turned even more chilly, and the wind is fresher than it was. You had better take us back, I think, before we catch the Teltherna egg. You have done very well. Here are another 10 meld for you. I'm sure you never gossip." "God bless you, sir," said the boatman, pulling on his right oar. "Where now?" asked Mollo, as they stepped ashore in the garden. "Your room, or mine? We can go on talking there." "Come, come, Mollo. The arrangements for eavesdropping will have been completed days ago. Dear me, those amateur instructors of yours in Dealgai. We will have a stroll through the town. Hide a leaf in the forest, you know. Now that priestess woman who addressed us this morning, the one with a face like a nightjar, would you say that she—" They made their way downhill, by way of the walled lane, to the Peacock Gate, and were shut into the little enclosed chamber called the Moon Room, where the porter, unseen, operated the counterpoise that opened the postern. There was no way between the upper and lower cities, except through this gate, and the porters, vigilant and uncommunicative as hounds, opened for none whom they had not been instructed to recognize. As Elleroth followed Mollo out into the lower city, the gate closed behind them, heavy, smooth, and flat, its iron flanges overlapping the walls on either side. For a few moments they stood alone above the din of the town, grinning at each other like 2 lads about to plunge together into a pool. The street of the armourers led downhill into the colonnaded square called the Caravan Market, where all the goods coming into the city were weighed and checked by the customs officers. On one side stood the city's warehouses, with their loading and unloading platforms, and Fleethill's brazen scales, which could weigh a cart and 2 oxen as easily as a sack of flour. Mollo was watching the weights being piled against 40 ingots of gilt iron, when a grimy-faced, ragged boy, limping on a crutch, stumbled against him, stooped quickly sideways with a kind of clumsy, sweeping bow, and then began to beg from him. No mother, sir, no father, a hard life, too meld, nothing to a gentleman like you. Generous face, easy to see you're lucky man. You like to meet a nice girl. Be careful of rogues here, many rogues in Pekla, many thieves. Perhaps one meld, need a fortune-teller. You like to gamble, perhaps. I meet you here tonight. Help a poor boy, no food today. His left leg had been severed above the ankle, and the stump, bound in dirty cloth, hung a foot above the ground. As he shifted his weight, the leg swung limply, as though there were no strength from the thigh down. He had lost a front tooth, and as he lisped out his monotonous, inexpressive offers and entreaties, red, betel-stained spittle crept over his lower lip and down his chin. He had a shifty-eyed, wary look, and kept his right arm slightly bent at his side, with the hand open, the thumb and fingers crooked like claws. Suddenly Elleroth stepped forward, gripped the boy's chin in his hand, and jerked up his face to meet his own eyes. The boy gave a shrill cry and tried to back away, pouring out more words, distorted now by Elleroth's grip on his jaw. Poor boy, no harm, gentleman won't hurt a poor boy, no work, very hard times, be of service. How long have you followed this life? Asked Elleroth sternly. The boy stammered with eyes averted. Don't know, sir. 4 years, sir. 5 years. Done no wrong, sir. 6 years, perhaps. Whatever you say. Elleroth, with his free hand, pulled up the boy's sleeve. Bound round the forearm was a broad leather band, and thrust beneath it by the blade was a handsome silver-hilted knife. Elleroth pulled it out and handed it back to Mollo. Didn't feel him take it, did you? That's the worst of wearing one's knife in a sheath on the hip. Now stop howling, my boy, or I'll see you flogged before the market warden. I'll see him flogged, howling or no, interrupted Mollo. Wait a moment, my dear fellow. Elleroth, still grasping the boy's chin, turned his head to one side, and with his other hand thrust back his dirty hair. The lobe of the ear was pierced by a round hole about as big as an orange pip. Elleroth touched it with his finger, and the boy began to weep silently. Genshed u arkan lutnada? Said Elleroth, speaking in Terkenalt, a tongue unknown to Mollo. The boy, who was unable to speak for his tears, nodded wretchedly. Genshed varon? Shuvaron u pekaronta? The boy nodded again. Listen, said Elleroth, reverting to Becklin. I am going to give you some money. As I do so, I shall curse you and pretend to hit you, for otherwise 100 wretches will come like vultures from every hole in the market. Say nothing, hide it, and go. Do you understand? Curse you! He shouted, gripping the boy's shoulder and pushing him away. Be off! Get away from me, filthy beggars! He turned on his heel and walked away with Mollo beside him. Now what the devil? Began Mollo. He broke off. Whatever's the matter, Elleroth? You're surely not weeping, are you? My dear Mollo, if you can't observe a knife vanishing from its sheath on your own hip, how can you possibly expect to observe accurately the expression on a face as foolish as mine? Let us turn in and have a drink. I feel I could do with one, and the sun's become rather warmer now. It will be pleasant to sit down.